He could order a man's death before breakfast and never lose his appetite. He'd rebuilt a criminal empire at 28 that older men had bled for decades to construct. But the moment Nico Moretti walked into that cramped bookstore on West 114th Street and heard a woman laugh, and not at him, not because of him, just laugh, like the world owed her nothing and she owed it less, something cracked open in his chest that no amount of money or fear could close again. She was 20 years older, wanted nothing he had, and that made her the most dangerous person he'd ever met. If this story hits you somewhere real, like it, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Yad. The morning it started, Nico Moretti was not supposed to be on West 114th Street at all. He was supposed to be in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a midtown tower, sitting across a mahogany table from 3 lawyers who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, signing documents that would quietly transfer 3 commercial properties from a shell company registered in Delaware into another shell company registered in Nevada. Clean work, invisible work. The kind of thing his Uncle Sal called the real business, as distinct from the uglier business, which was what happened when the real business broke down. Instead, Nico was standing on a sidewalk in Morningside Heights, with his tie loosened and his jacket thrown over one arm, breathing cold October air and trying to remember why he'd told his driver to stop. He'd seen the sign from the car window, just the sign, hand-lettered on a wooden board, black paint on cream, the words Brooks and Company. Books, maps, lost things. Something about those last 2 words had made him say, without planning to, pull over. His driver, a large and patient man named Caruso who had worked for the Moretti family for 19 years and had stopped asking questions sometime around year 4, pulled over. Nico got out. He didn't know why. He'd grown up being told that impulse was weakness, that a man who acted without calculation was a man who'd end up in the ground before his time. His father had said it. His uncle had said it. The priest at Sacred Heart had said something adjacent to it, wrapped in different language. And Nico, to his credit and his detriment, had absorbed those lessons well. He calculated everything. He walked into every room already knowing where the exits were. He kept his face neutral and his voice quiet, and he made decisions that other men flinched from, and he did all of it with a kind of cold efficiency that had earned him, by his 28th birthday, a reputation that was useful in some rooms and terrifying in others. But standing on West 114th Street on a Tuesday morning in October, he could not tell you why he'd told Caruso to stop. He pushed open the door of the bookstore. A bell above the door made a small, tired sound. The store was narrow and deep, like a hallway that had given up trying to be anything else. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on both walls, crammed with books that had clearly been organized at some point in the past and then slowly, over years, allowed to achieve their own internal logic. There were stacks on the floor, a rolling ladder on a brass track. Somewhere in the back, a lamp with a yellow shade cast a warm circle of light onto a reading table where a coffee mug was steaming. The whole place smelled like paper and something else. Maybe cedar, maybe whatever candle burned low on the front counter, maybe just time. Nico stood inside the door for a moment and said nothing. "We're open," a voice said from somewhere behind a shelf. Despite all evidence, he walked toward the voice. She was standing on the 3rd rung of a step stool, reaching for a book on a high shelf, and she didn't look down at him when he appeared around the corner. She was tall even without the stool, with dark hair threaded through with silver pulled back in a loose knot at the back of her neck. She was wearing a worn gray cardigan over a white shirt, jeans, boots. Her hands were long and unhurried. She found the book she was looking for, came down off the stool, and only then looked at him. She looked at him the way people who have been around a long time look at things they haven't quite cataloged yet. Not suspicious, not impressed, just observing. "Can I help you find something?" she said. Nico, who could walk into a meeting with men who frightened other men and say exactly the right thing at the right time, found himself briefly without language. "I'm not sure," he said. She nodded like that was a reasonable answer. That's usually why people come in. That was when she laughed. Not at him, just at something. The way she moved back behind the counter and set the book down and reached for her coffee. And it wasn't a performance laugh, wasn't a trying to put you at ease laugh. It was just a sound that came out of her because something in the private running commentary of her own mind had struck her as funny. Small laugh. Real one. Nico Moretti, who had not laughed at something genuinely funny in longer than he could immediately remember, stood in a bookstore on a Tuesday morning and felt something shift behind his ribs. He bought a book he didn't want, about the history of cartography, because it was sitting on the counter and he needed a reason to have walked in. He paid cash. She made change without looking at his hands or his watch or his suit, which was the suit of a man who did not shop where normal people shopped. "Come back if you get lost," she said when he turned to go. He looked back at her. "What?" She gestured at the sign above the door, visible from inside. "Lost things. That's the other half of what we carry." He didn't respond to that. He walked out. He got back in the car. Caruso pulled away from the curb without asking anything, because Caruso was a professional and a saint. Nico sat in the back seat with the book about cartography in his lap and stared out the window at the city moving past and thought about the way she'd laughed. He went back the following Thursday. He told himself he was in the neighborhood. He was not in the neighborhood. He had Caruso drive 40 minutes out of his way to be in the neighborhood. Her name was on the store, Brooks, but he didn't know her first name until she signed a receipt for a book she'd ordered for someone else, which was sitting on the counter, and he glanced at the signature without meaning to and read Vivian in a clear, angular hand. Vivian Brooks. He bought another book he didn't need. This time it was a collection of essays about architecture in post-war New York. She'd recommended it when he'd mentioned, offhandedly, testing whether she'd respond to him differently if he said something intelligent, that he'd been reading about the urban renewal projects of the 60s. She hadn't responded differently. She'd just pulled the book from a shelf 3 rows back without looking, handed it to him and said, "This'll make you angry." Most good books do. He went back the week after that. And the week after that. By the 6th visit, she knew his name. He'd told her, and she'd said Nico the way people say a name when they're deciding if it fits. And she knew he took his coffee black and that he had strong opinions about whether city planning was a form of control. And he knew that she'd bought the store 11 years ago after her divorce, that she'd been a literature professor before that at Columbia, that she had a daughter in Portland who called on Sundays and sometimes didn't, and that she did not own a television because she'd gotten rid of it the same year she'd gotten rid of the marriage and had never missed either one. He didn't tell her what he did. He said he worked in real estate, which was true, in the narrowest sense. The Moretti family owned a great deal of real estate, and Vivian either believed it or didn't push, and either way she seemed genuinely uninterested in his professional life, which was something he had never experienced before from anyone who knew his name. The truth came out on the 7th visit. He hadn't planned it. Planning would have told him to keep the story clean. What happened was that he came in on a Wednesday afternoon and there were 2 men standing inside the store, near the back, and the way they were standing, weight shifted forward, hands loose at their sides, the specific language of bodies that were prepared to apply pressure, made something in Nico go very quiet and very focused at the same time. Vivian was behind the counter, and her face was doing something careful, not frightened exactly, contained. "These gentlemen," she said when she saw Nico, "were just explaining to me that the building's new management has some concerns about my lease." Nico looked at the 2 men. They looked at him. One of them, the bigger one, with a jaw like a loading dock, started to say something, and Nico said quietly, "Who sent you?" It wasn't a question. The tone of it changed the air in the room. The 2 men looked at each other. The bigger one said, "We work for Castellano Property Group." Nico nodded once. "Tell Richie Castellano that this store is under Moretti consideration. If he has lease concerns, he can call my office." He took out a card, plain white, nothing on it but a phone number, and set it on the counter. "Today." The 2 men left. Vivian watched them go, then she looked at the card on her counter, then she looked at Nico. "Moretti," she said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he could hear the street sounds bleeding through the glass and the faint tick of the radiator, and his own pulse doing something it didn't usually do. "You're not in real estate," she said. "I am," he said. "Among other things." She looked at him with that same measuring look she'd given him on the first day, Except this time there was something else moving underneath it. Not fear. Something more considered than fear. "I know that name," she said. "Moretti. I know what it means in this city. Most people do. And you've been coming into my store for 6 weeks buying books you don't read." "I read them." She raised an eyebrow, a small, skeptical arc. "The cartography one was actually good," he said. Something in her face almost moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "You should go," she said. "Okay." He went. He stood outside on the sidewalk in the October cold and breathed air that tasted like exhaust and fallen leaves, and he waited for the feeling of forward motion that usually came after he made a decision, the clean, mechanical click of next step, and it didn't come. What came instead was the awareness that he was going to go back. He knew it the way he knew other unavoidable things, the way he'd known at 23 that his father was dying, and that the weight of everything the old man had built was going to fall on him specifically, not because he was the most powerful person around the table, but because he was the one most willing to carry the thing that couldn't be put down. He went back the following week. She let him in without comment. She was rearranging a display near the window, something involving a stack of atlases and a hand-drawn sign about a traveling exhibition she'd curated. He watched her work for a minute. She didn't ask him to leave. She didn't pretend he wasn't there. "I'm not going to become something different," she said, without turning around. "Because of whatever you want from me." "I know that." "Do you?" Still not a question. She turned around. She was wearing a different cardigan today, rust-colored, and there was a smudge of something, ink maybe or pencil lead, on the side of her left hand. "Because men like you are used to things bending." "Not everything," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away, neither did she. "You're 20 years younger than me," she said. 20, he said. "Yeah. That's not a small number." "No." She turned back to the atlases, placed one, adjusted it. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people deciding something without saying it out loud. "There's a reading tonight," she said eventually. "A poet from Harlem. Starts at 7. She paused. "Store closes at 9. Nico stood in the afternoon light of Vivian Brooks's bookstore and felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with it at the same time. "I'll be here at 7, he said. She didn't respond. He took that as the answer it was. He was at the store at 6:50. Not 7. He told himself he would arrive at 7, that arriving early was the kind of thing that revealed too much, and then he'd sat in the car outside at 6:40 and gotten out at 6:50 because waiting felt worse than arriving. The reading was small, a dozen people in folding chairs, plus Vivian behind the counter, and a young man with a notebook who turned out to be the poet. The poems were raw and not always comfortable, and the kind of thing Nico would not normally have sat still for. He sat still for all of them. Not because the poems required it, but because sitting in that room, in that specific quality of yellow lamp light, listening to language that didn't have a tactical use, was something he hadn't done in a long time, and his body didn't want to leave. Vivian moved through the space with easy authority, refilling glasses, making introductions, keeping the conversation loose and warm without performing any of it. She was good at it in the way someone is good at a thing they've been doing for so long, it's become indistinguishable from who they are. She didn't look at him specifically, but once, halfway through the reading, she set a glass of water on the table beside his chair without being asked, without saying anything, and that small gesture, that simple human noticing, hit him somewhere in the center of his chest with a force he was not prepared for. After the reading, after the poet and the guests had filtered out, Nico helped stack the folding chairs. He didn't ask if she wanted help. He just did it. She noticed but didn't comment. When the last chair was against the wall and the shop was quiet, she made 2 cups of tea. He didn't drink tea and didn't say so. And they sat at the reading table under the yellow lamp and talked for 2 hours. Not about anything important. Books he'd read when he was young and then stopped reading. A neighborhood in Rome where his grandfather had grown up that no longer existed in the form the old man had described it. The particular kind of silence in a bookstore after closing that she said was different from any other silence she'd found. He told her more than he meant to. That was the thing about Vivian Brooks. She didn't pull information out of you. She just made space, and things fell into it. He did not tell her about the specific nature of his business, but he told her about the weight of it, the way it felt to be the person other people looked to when the ground was uncertain, the particular loneliness of that position. Things he had not said to anyone in years, maybe ever, because the people around him either worked for him or needed something from him, and there was no one in his life who just listened without calculating what the information meant for their own position. She listened. She didn't offer reassurance or strategy. She just sat with it. At 11:15, she stood and said, "I have to be up at 6. He stood. He put on his jacket. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for the evening, for the tea, for sitting in the dark with him for 2 hours and not asking anything of him and not being afraid of him." He didn't say all of that. He just said thank you. "Come back," she said, "when you want to talk about something that isn't the weight of your life." He laughed. He didn't plan to. It came out of him like something that had been waiting. She smiled at that. A real one, finally, not the ghost of one, and turned off the yellow lamp. The relationship grew the way certain things grow in cities, sideways, through cracks, without the space that would have made it easier. There was no moment where he asked, and she agreed. There was a progression of evenings, of cups of tea and Tuesday afternoons and a Saturday in November when she closed the store early and they walked for 3 hours through Riverside Park in the cold without deciding to, and ended up at a diner on Broadway where they ate eggs at 4 in the afternoon and the conversation never stopped. He told her about his father that day, not the facts of his father's death, which were a matter of some historical record in certain circles, but about the man himself, the way he'd smelled like tobacco and winter air, the way he'd told stories about his own father with a kind of grief that never hardened into anything clean. The way Nico had sat at his bedside near the end and been given the family in the way a man is given a debt, not with joy, but with gravity and a complete absence of alternative. Vivian had listened and then said, "Did you want it?" No one had ever asked him that. "No," he said, the first time he'd said it to anyone. "But it was mine." She'd nodded, not with pity, with understanding, which was different. In December, he kissed her, outside the store. It was cold and there was sleet, and he'd been walking her to the door after a dinner 3 blocks away, and she'd stopped to look for her keys, and when she looked up, he was closer than he'd planned to be, and instead of stepping back, he'd stayed. And she'd looked at him for long enough that he thought she was going to say no, and then she'd kissed him first. It was not a careful kiss. It was the kind of kiss that closes a door you can't reopen. He told his Uncle Sal in January. He didn't plan that either. Sal asked, in the direct way of men who have lived long enough to dispense with approach, whether Nico was seeing someone, because he was arriving to things with a specific quality of distraction that Sal had only seen once before, in Nico's father, who had been distracted in that way by Nico's mother for the first 2 years of their marriage, and then never again. Nico said yes. Sal asked who. Nico told him. He watched his uncle's face go through several stages that were visible even behind the man's careful expression. Confusion, recalibration, something that was trying to be understanding and not quite getting there. "How old is she?" Sal said. 48. The silence after that was the specific silence of a man holding himself back from saying several things. "She's a civilian," Sal said, finally. "Yes." "She's not—" Sal stopped. Started again. "Nico, the Catalano girl is still asking. Her family is— There are arrangements that make sense for the family right now." "I know. A woman like that, what you're describing, that's not—" Sal made a gesture that meant many things and none of them good. "I know what it looks like," Nico said. "Do you?" Sal looked at him. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a 28-year-old man who runs this family getting distracted by a woman who's going to become a liability." Nico looked back at his uncle. Sal was 61 and had been in the family since before Nico was born, and he loved Nico in the specific, complicated way that men in that world love the people they are also responsible for, which is to say, not gently. "She's not a liability," Nico said. "Not yet," Sal said. That word stayed with Nico on the drive home. Not yet. The implication of it. The direction. He called Vivian that night. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the slightly distracted quality it had when she was reading. "What are you doing?" he said. "Arguing with Fitzgerald," she said. "In my head. He's losing." He laughed. She asked what was wrong. He said nothing. She said, "You called me at 11 on a Thursday to say nothing?" "I wanted to hear your voice," he said. A pause. "Nico." "Yeah." "You know this is going to get complicated." "I know." Another pause. Longer. He could hear her breathing and the small sounds of her apartment and the distant city. "I'm not going to run from complicated," she said, "but you need to be honest with me about what complicated means in your world." "I know that too." "Do you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It means that there are people around me who will see you as a problem, who will try to make you one." Vivian was quiet on her end. Then, "And what do you do about that?" "I don't know yet," he said. Which was, for Nico Moretti, an extraordinary admission. He didn't say things he didn't know yet. He presented conclusions. "That's the first honest thing you've said tonight," she said. "Yeah." "Get some sleep," she said. We'll figure out the rest." She hung up. He sat in the dark of his apartment in a building with 3 layers of security and the kind of silence that wealth buys, and felt the distance between his world and hers like a physical thing. Not insurmountable, but real. Something to be crossed every time, not once. He didn't know, sitting there, that in 3 weeks his cousin Marco would find out about Vivian through a family dinner conversation that took a wrong turn, and that Marco would think it was funny in the particular mean way of men who mistake cruelty for candor. He didn't know that Marco would send 2 women to the bookstore dressed as customers who would spend an hour looking through books and talking to each other, loudly enough to be heard, about the embarrassment of certain older women who confused attention for love. He didn't know that Vivian would hear every word of it and understand exactly what it was and say nothing to Nico. He didn't know any of that yet. What he knew, sitting in the dark, was that she was the first person in years who had made him feel like the weight he carried was something he'd chosen, not something that had swallowed him. And that for a man like him, in a world like his, that feeling was the most dangerous thing he'd ever let himself have. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, Nico walked into the bookstore and found Vivian behind the counter with her jaw set and her eyes doing something careful again. That containing expression he'd learned to read, the one that wasn't fear but was managing whatever was on the other side of fear. He asked what was wrong. She said nothing was wrong. He looked at her for a long moment and she held his gaze, steady, the way she did everything. And he thought about pressing it and then didn't, because Vivian Brooks was not a woman you pressed, and because he could feel, with the instinct he'd developed over a lifetime, in rooms where what wasn't said was always more important than what was, that something had shifted. Something had already happened. He just didn't know yet that by the time he found out what it was, she would already be gone. The 2 women had come in on a Tuesday. Vivian remembered the day clearly, because Tuesdays were slow. The kind of slow that gave her time to reorganize the map section, which she'd been meaning to do since September. And she'd been halfway up the rolling ladder when the bell above the door sounded twice in quick succession. 2 women, late 30s, dressed well. The kind of well that wasn't accidental. One in a camel coat, one in something dark green that probably cost more than Vivian's monthly rent. She'd come down from the ladder, said what she always said, "Let me know if you need anything." They didn't need anything. They moved through the store the way people move through a space when the space isn't the point, picking up books and setting them down without reading the covers. Drifting. Vivian had gone back to the maps and tried not to listen, and failed. "I heard she's been seeing him for months," the one in the camel coat said, not quietly, the kind of not quietly that is a choice. "Months." The other one made a sound, not a laugh, something shorter. "That's almost sad." "Almost. You'd think she'd know, at her age." A pause, and in the pause the weight of the word, age, settled into the room like something dropped on purpose. "That men like that don't... What's she expecting? A proposal? She probably thinks she's different. They all think they're different. Vivian had stayed on the ladder. Her hand on the shelf was steady. She made herself keep it steady. She moved a map of 1940s New York 2 inches to the left and then moved it back and breathed through her nose and listened to the rest of it, which was more of the same, variations on a theme. The theme being that she was a woman of a certain age who had mistaken the attention of a powerful young man for something it wasn't, and that this was at best pathetic and at worst evidence of a kind of delusion, particular to women who had missed their window for the kind of life that was worth being seen. They bought nothing. They left. Vivian came down off the ladder. She stood in the maps section for a moment. Then she went behind the counter and she finished her coffee, which had gone cold, and she opened the notebook she kept beside the register for writing down book orders, and she stared at the blank page for a while. She did not cry. She was 52 years removed from the version of herself that cried in public spaces, even empty ones. What she did was think, which was, for Vivian Brooks, more dangerous. She didn't tell Nico. That was the decision she made, standing behind the counter with cold coffee and a blank notebook page. She didn't tell him because she already knew what he would do. She'd seen what he'd done with the two men from Castellano Property Group, the quiet authority of it, the way the room had reorganized itself around his voice. And she didn't want that. She didn't want to be the reason he applied that kind of force to his own family. She didn't want to find out what it cost him to protect her. She also didn't tell him because the women hadn't been wrong about everything. That was the part she sat with, in the evenings after he left, in the particular silence of her apartment that she'd built over 11 years into something that suited exactly her. The part where she looked at the actual shape of what she and Nico were doing and tried to see it without the warmth that his presence generated. He was 28. She was 48. He ran a criminal organization that she knew, in the way you know things you've read in newspapers and heard in passing conversations, had caused real damage to real people in this city. She owned a bookstore. She had a daughter in Portland who called on Sundays and sometimes didn't. She'd been divorced for 11 years from a man who was decent but wrong for her, and she'd spent those 11 years building a life that required very little from anyone and gave her back, in return, a quality of quiet she had not fully appreciated until someone had walked through her door and started making noise in her chest again. She was not naive. She knew the difference between the feeling a thing gave you and the thing itself. But she also knew, and this was the part she couldn't argue herself out of, that Nico Moretti was not performing. Whatever he was doing when he sat at her reading table and talked until 11 and looked at her like she was the steadiest thing in a room full of moving parts, that was real. She'd been a literature professor for 16 years. She'd studied the gap between what people said and what they meant for long enough that she could feel the difference in her bones. He was real. What he felt was real. That made it worse, not better. She was thinking about all of this on the Thursday he came in and asked what was wrong. She said nothing was wrong, which was not a lie exactly, but was not the truth. He looked at her the way he looked at things when he was measuring them, that steady, dark-eyed assessment, and she held his gaze and did not flinch, and after a moment he let it go. But she felt him not let it go, underneath. She felt the question stay in the room between them, like a door that had been closed but not locked. He stayed for 2 hours that afternoon. They talked about a biography of Robert Moses she'd been reading, and about a water damage issue in the back storage room that was going to cost more than she had immediately available, and about whether the diner on Broadway had gotten worse or whether they'd simply been going there often enough to notice what had always been true. Normal conversation. The texture of two people who had built a habit of each other. He left at 6. He kissed her at the door. That had become a thing now, the door kiss, brief and certain, the kind of physical punctuation that accumulates meaning over time. And she put her hand flat against his chest for a moment and felt his heartbeat, and then he left. She stood in the store after the bell above the door had sounded and the silence had come back, and she thought, I am going to lose this. The question is whether I lose it now, on my own terms, or later, when the losing will be worse. She opened the notebook. This time she wrote something in it. Not a book order. Quote, the eruption inside the Moretti family did not announce itself. It built the way pressure builds, incrementally, invisibly, until it wasn't invisible anymore. Nico became aware of it in pieces, a comment at a dinner in early February that his cousin Marco made and then covered with a laugh. A look between his Aunt Teresa and her daughter Julia that stopped when he walked into the kitchen. A silence at the end of a phone call with Sal that went on 2 beats longer than it should have before Sal said, "We'll talk Thursday," and hung up. Thursday came. The meeting was at the house in Pelham, the family house, the one Nico's father had bought in 1987, and that still smelled in the hallways near the kitchen of the tobacco the old man had smoked until the year he couldn't. Nico drove himself, which he rarely did, and parked on the street and walked up the path to the front door and stood on the porch for a moment looking at the bare trees in the yard before going in. Sal was in the sitting room. Marco was there. So was Nico's Aunt Rosa, who was Sal's wife, and who handled the family's charitable enterprises, and who had a face that gave away nothing, and eyes that gave away everything if you knew how to read them. And there was Don Enzo Calabrese, who was 73 and not family by blood, but had been in the room at every significant decision the Moretti family had made for 30 years, and whose presence at a Thursday afternoon meeting in Pelham meant that whatever was being discussed had already been discussed. Nico sat down. He did not take off his coat. "We're going to talk about the woman," Sal said. "Call her by her name," Nico said. Sal looked at him. "Vivian Brooks." "Go ahead." Sal leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was the posture he took when he was trying to be both direct and careful, a combination he'd never quite mastered. "There's been talk, not just in the family, in other places." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that makes us look distracted." Sal chose the word deliberately. "The Ferrara people. The people up in Westchester. They're looking at the last 6 months, and what they see is a young boss who is spending his time in a bookstore in Morningside Heights instead of what?" Nico said. His voice was even. It was the most dangerous version of his voice, the one that had no edge because the edge had been removed on purpose. Marco shifted in his chair. He was 31, Marco, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had always been protected by proximity to power without ever having to generate any of his own. He said, "It's embarrassing, Nico. That's what Sal's trying to say. The woman she's not." "Finish that sentence," Nico said. Marco stopped. Don Enzo cleared his throat. When Enzo spoke, it was with the particular authority of a man who had outlived most of the people who disagreed with him. "I knew your father," he said, which was always how he started. "He made one bad decision in his life, in 1994, and it cost this family a port operation that took 8 years to rebuild." He paused. "He also made one excellent decision in 1986, which was your mother. Sometimes those two things look the same from the outside before you know which one it is." The room was quiet after that. Sal looked at Enzo with something that might have been frustration. "The difference," Rosa said, speaking for the first time in the quiet, careful way she had, "is that your mother understood the world she was entering. She came from it. She knew its rules." "Vivian Brooks is a schoolteacher," Marco said. Then, catching Nico's eyes, "A professor, former, who runs a bookstore." "I know what she does," Nico said. "She has no protection," Rosa said. "Not from us, not from anyone. If someone wanted to use her against you, no one is going to use her against me. You can't know that. I can make it true." The silence this time was different. It had weight. Sal said, "Nico." The word carried something that wasn't quite a plea and wasn't quite a warning. Something in between. "The Catalano girl is still. The family is still. There are alliances here that matter, that protect everyone. You understand that." "I understand everything you're saying," Nico said. He stood. He buttoned his coat. "I want to be clear with everyone in this room about where I am on this. I'm going to see Vivian Brooks. That's not changing. If anyone in this family decides to make that a problem." He looked at Marco specifically, and Marco looked at the floor. "They'll be answering to me for it directly. Not through Sal, not through anyone. Directly." He picked up his keys from the table. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. He drove back to the city. His hands were steady on the wheel. His jaw hurt, which meant he'd been grinding it, which meant his body had been doing something his face hadn't. He called Vivian from the car. She answered on the second ring. "Are you free tonight?" he said. "I'm in the middle of something. I'll come to you." A pause. She could read him across a phone call now, which was new and still slightly disorienting. "Are you okay?" "I'll tell you when I see you," he said. She said, 8 o'clock. He said, 8, he was there at 7:45. He knocked, and she opened the door and looked at him the way she looked at things she was trying to diagnose and said, "Come in." And he came in and she took his coat and he sat at her kitchen table, which was where they always ended up, and she put the kettle on without asking. He told her about the meeting. He gave her the facts of it, not the feelings, because the facts were bad enough. He watched her face while he talked. She was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, not defensively. She was never defensive in her body. It wasn't how she was built, but in the way of someone containing a response while they finished listening. When he finished, she said, "Who sent the women?" He stopped. "What women?" She told him, flat and clean, the way she did everything when she'd decided something needed to be said, without drama and without softening. The Tuesday, the camel coat, the things they'd said. He listened and his jaw tightened and she watched it tighten. "Marco," he said. "Probably." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew what you'd do." "You knew what I'd do," he repeated. Not angry at her. Something more complicated than angry. "Vivian, they came into your store. I know what they did." Her voice was steady. "I was there." He pushed back from the table, not violently. He was never violent in ways he hadn't decided on, but with the specific restlessness of a man whose instinct to act was meeting a wall. He stood. He put his hands on the kitchen counter and looked at nothing for a moment. "I can handle Marco," he said. "I know you can." "Then why?" "Because handling Marco doesn't fix the larger thing." She uncrossed her arms. She moved to the table and sat down across from where he'd been sitting, which put her below him, and she looked up at him. "Nico, I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks. The structure of the problem. I'm a literature professor, even a former one. I know how to read the shape of a story, and the shape of this one is that I am a point of vulnerability in your life. That's not my opinion. That's what your family said, and they're not entirely wrong. That's not... Let me finish." He stopped. She said, "I'm not saying I agree with their conclusion. I'm saying that the world they're operating in is one where the people who want to hurt you will look for the thing that matters to you and apply pressure there. I'm that thing. I have no defenses that would make any difference in your world. A bookstore and 48 years of being difficult to rattle, those are not armor." "I know that," he said, quieter now. "So what are you going to do?" He sat back down. He looked at her across the table. His hands were flat on the wood. "I'm going to make it clear to everyone in my family and outside it that any move against you is a move against me. Directly. And if that invites exactly the thing you're trying to prevent, it won't." "How do you know?" "Because the people I'm dealing with are not stupid. They're calculating. And the calculation that says touch Vivian Brooks and find out what Nico Moretti does, that's a calculation that ends in a specific direction that nobody wants to find out." She was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about your capacity to hurt people." "Yes." She didn't flinch from that. He'd known she wouldn't. She hadn't flinched from anything yet, which was one of the things about her that made him feel like he could breathe without thinking about it. But she held the word, held the reality of it. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I want you to know that's real. I've thought about it. Whether I should be, whether I'm being naive, and I'm not. What I am is afraid of what being with me cost you. That's my cost to decide. Nico." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, just flat on his, warm. "I need you to hear what I'm actually saying, not what you want to hear." He turned his hand over, held hers. "I'm listening. I am not going to be the reason this family fractures. I'm not going to be the thing that rivals look at and see weakness. Not because I don't..." She stopped, breathed once. "Not because I don't care about this. I do. I care about this more than I plan to, but I have spent 11 years building a life that I do not want to see turned into collateral damage in someone else's war. It's my war, he said. I choose the terms. You don't always get to choose the terms. In my world, I do. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. The word was too short and too simple, and he felt it land with a weight that didn't match its size. He didn't know, looking at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, what she'd decided. He didn't know that okay, in this case, was not agreement, but the end of an argument she'd already resolved by herself, on her own terms, before he'd walked through the door. He found out later what okay had meant. In March, the outside pressure arrived. It came in the form of a man named Vincent Soto, who ran the Westchester operation and who had been watching the Moretti family's internal dynamic with the patient attention of someone who traded in information the way other people traded in goods. Soto was careful and smart, and he'd been waiting for something like this. A crack, a distraction, a point of internal friction that he could slip a wedge into and widen. He didn't come at Nico directly. He came at the family. He started reaching out to Marco, not offering anything explicit, nothing that could be reported back to Nico as an act of betrayal without sounding paranoid, just conversations, meetings for dinner in places where Marco could tell himself he was just eating, slow, careful cultivation of the idea that the family's current leadership was costing them positioning, that certain opportunities were going unaddressed while the boss was busy in Morningside Heights, that the men who'd built this family deserved leadership that was, here Soto was very careful with his language, fully present. Marco was not a fool, but he was also not the kind of man who had learned to recognize the difference between being recruited and being managed. He heard Soto's words and heard them as agreement, as validation, as the outside world confirming what he'd already believed. He thought he was talking to an ally. He was talking to someone who was using him like a lever. Nico found out about the dinners in mid-March through a man named Paulie, who had worked for the family since before Nico's father died, and whose loyalty was the functional and unsentimental kind. Not based on love, but on the clear-eyed calculation that Nico Moretti was a better boss to work for than anyone else available, and that information was the most valuable thing Paulie had to offer, and he offered it consistently. Nico sat with the information for 2 days before doing anything. That was discipline, the kind his father had taught him. Act from decision, not reaction. Know what you want the outcome to be before you take the first step. What he wanted was for Marco to understand, in terms that could not be misread, that what he was doing had been seen. Not a public confrontation that would require a response that escalated things past useful. A private one, the kind that left no record and no room for interpretation. He called Marco and said, "Come to the office." Marco came to the office. The office was in a building on the east side, a real estate management company that was what it said it was, and also several other things. Nico was behind the desk when Marco arrived. He did not invite Marco to sit. He put Paulie's information on the desk between them. Not literally. There was no document, no recording, but he named what he knew, specifically and without drama, and he watched Marco's face go through denial, recalibration, and arrival at something that was trying to be dignity, but was really just fear with better posture. "I was just listening," Marco said, "to Vincent Soto. He's not... It was dinner. He wanted to talk. I know what he wanted," Nico said. "The question is what you wanted." Marco opened his mouth, closed it. "Look at me," Nico said. Marco looked at him. "If you have a problem with how I'm running this family, you bring it to me. You don't go sit with Vincent Soto and let him put ideas in your head about what the family needs, because what he's actually doing is using you. And what you're doing, whether you mean to or not, is giving him information about our internal situation that he will use against us." He paused. "Against you, not just me." Marco's jaw tightened. "The family has concerns, Nico. I'm not the only one. Name one concern that you've brought to me directly." Silence. "Name one." "The woman," Marco said, not moving his eyes. He'd found some version of his nerve, the kind that emerges from having nothing left to hide. "Vivian Brooks, that's the concern. That you're making decisions from a place of careful, From a place that isn't clear. Marco held his ground. She's not one of us. She's not protected. She's a walking opportunity for anyone who wants to get to you, and you know that, and you're choosing her anyway, and the rest of us have to live with the consequences of that choice. Nico stood. He was not tall, 5'11", average build, nothing physically imposing about him except the way he moved, which was the way of someone who never occupied space by accident. He looked at Marco from across the desk and let the silence work for a few seconds. "You're my blood," he said. "That means something to me. I want to be clear about that." A beat. "It also means that when you do something that damages this family, like sitting across a dinner table from Vincent Soto and complaining about my personal life, I handle it myself directly instead of letting it become something that can't be walked back." He moved around the desk, stopped a foot from Marco. "This is the walk back, Marco. Right now, this conversation. You go home, you don't take calls from Soto, and you come to me with concerns going forward. That's how this works." Marco held his gaze for as long as he could, which was long enough to maintain some version of self-respect, and then looked away. "Fine," he said. "Good." Marco left. Nico stood in the office alone for a moment, and he thought about Vivian's voice saying, "I am not going to be the reason this family fractures." And he thought about the weight of that, the specific burden of being loved by someone who is already trying to protect you from loving her back. He called her that night, and she answered, and they talked for an hour about nothing dangerous and everything true, and when he hung up, he felt the ground under him as something real and worth standing on. He did not know that 3 floors below his office, in a parking garage on 51st Street, Marco was already calling Vincent Soto back. The campaign against Vivian escalated in April. It came in layers, and the layers were designed so that no single one of them was something Nico could point to as a clear line crossed. A slow leak of her name into certain circles. Not anything specific, not accusations, just the suggestion of her existence in Nico's life attached to language that framed it as instability. A word put in with the landlord of her building about a lease irregularity that turned out to be nothing but required 2 weeks of anxiety and a lawyer to resolve. A review posted online about the bookstore. Not vicious, worse than vicious, dismissive. The particular kind of one-star dismissal that sounds like genuine disappointment and is designed to accumulate. Vivian did not tell Nico about the landlord situation until it was resolved. She did not tell him about the review. She dealt with them the way she dealt with things she could handle herself, which was to handle them without narration. But she was keeping a list, in the same notebook where she'd written the things she hadn't written a book order on back in January. She was documenting what was happening, in the clear angular handwriting of someone who used to grade papers. Not for Nico, for herself. Nico found out about the landlord issue through someone else. Through Caruso, who had been talking to someone, who had mentioned it in passing. And he came into the bookstore on a Wednesday in April, and his jaw was doing the thing again, the tight thing, and he said, "Tell me about your building." She looked at him. "How do you know about that?" "Tell me." She told him. He listened without expression, which was the expression that meant he was furious and containing it. "That was Marco," he said, "or someone working for Marco, or someone working for someone Marco's been talking to." "Same thing." "Not exactly," she said. "Nico, the difference matters." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if it's Marco acting alone out of family loyalty, that's one thing. If it's Marco coordinating with outside people to destabilize you through me, that's something structurally different and much more dangerous for everyone." He was quiet. He was looking at her the way he sometimes did when she said something that reorganized what he'd been thinking, the way a lens adjusts. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I've been thinking about this for months," she said. "You've been thinking about it and not telling me." "I've been thinking about it," she said, "and deciding what to do about it." The word deciding landed between them with the specific weight it carried when Vivian used it, which was the weight of a conclusion already reached. "What did you decide?" he said. She looked at him across the counter. The yellow lamp was on. The store was quiet. Through the window, the April street moved with the particular light of a city afternoon that has no knowledge of what's happening inside. "I haven't finished deciding yet," she said, which was the first time she'd said something to him that wasn't entirely true. She had finished deciding. She'd finished in the notebook on the page that was not a book order. She'd written it out in the clear way she wrote everything, and she'd read it back to herself. And she'd sat with it for 3 days, and she hadn't found a reason to change it. What she'd written was, if staying means watching him fracture the thing he's built and inherit the enemies of everyone who works against him, then the most honest thing I can do is leave before he has to choose. She hadn't told him. She was going to. She just hadn't decided on the when yet. And on that Wednesday in April, with the yellow lamp on and his jaw tight and the April light coming through the window, she looked at Nico Moretti, at the specific quality of damage and care in his face, at the way he stood in her store like it was the one room in the city where he wasn't managing anything. And she pushed the when back one more time, because she was not, whatever her other qualities, made of stone. But the week after that, a woman named Gabriella Ferrara walked into the bookstore. She didn't come as a customer. She came as herself, wife of Dominic Ferrara, which meant something in the specific geography of New York organized crime, and she walked in with the particular assurance of someone who had been sent with a message and knew the message would be received. She was polite. She was impeccably dressed. She sat down across from Vivian at the reading table, and she spoke in the measured tone of someone who has been told to be civil and is managing it through effort. She said, "I want to be honest with you." Vivian said, "That's a nice change of pace." Gabriella looked at her. Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, maybe something closer to assessment, a recalibration of what she'd expected to find here. "My husband and Salvatore Moretti have a long relationship," Gabriella said. "A productive one. That relationship depends on stability in the Moretti organization. What is happening?" She paused, chose the word yes. "With you and Nico is creating instability." "Is that what your husband told you to say?" "It's what I'm telling you." "And what does instability mean specifically?" Vivian's voice was even, professional. The voice of a woman who had run seminars on difficult texts for 20 years. "Because I've been hearing that word for months, and no one has explained the mechanism." Gabriella looked at her for a moment. "The mechanism," she said, and something in her tone shifted. Less performance, more actual conversation, as if she hadn't expected Vivian to engage in those terms. "Is that there are people who want to see Nico Moretti fail. And those people are watching his family fracture over you, and they're encouraged by it. They're actively making plans based on the assumption that he is distracted and his family is divided, and the moment to move against him is arriving." She set her hands flat on the table. "That is the mechanism." Vivian was quiet. "I don't say this to frighten you," Gabriella said. "I say it because you are clearly not a stupid woman, and I think you deserve the actual truth rather than another set of people sent to your store to be unpleasant." "Do you know about the women in February?" Vivian said. A pause. Something crossed Gabriella's face. "That wasn't us." "I know. We don't operate that way." "I believe you." Gabriella looked at her. "Then you understand what I'm telling you." "I understand what you're telling me," Vivian said. "I'm not sure I agree with your conclusion about what I should do with the information." "What do you think you should do?" Vivian looked at the table for a moment, then at the window, then back at Gabriella Ferrara, who had come into her store with the specific errand of convincing her to leave, and who had, despite that, managed to be the most honest person to sit across from her in months. "I think," Vivian said, "that there are things I need to figure out on my own." Gabriella stood. She picked up her bag. "The timeline," she said at the door, "is not as long as you might think. The people who want to move against him, they're not waiting indefinitely." She left. The bell above the door made its tired sound. Vivian sat at the reading table alone. She put both hands flat on the wood. She breathed through her nose once and then again, and she looked at the door for a long time after it closed. Then she opened the notebook. She wrote one more line under what she'd written in January. She wrote, "Soon." She closed the notebook. She turned off the yellow lamp. And 3 days later, when Nico came to the store on a Friday afternoon and knocked and found the door locked and the lights off, and a note taped to the glass in her clear, angular hand that said only, "I'm sorry," Don't look for me. V, he stood on the sidewalk in the April cold and felt something tear open in him that had no name, and the note was still in his hand when Caruso found him. Caruso had been parked half a block down, the way he always was, far enough to give Nico the fiction of privacy and close enough to matter if anything went wrong. He'd seen Nico knock on the locked door. He'd seen him stand there. He'd seen him read something taped to the glass and then not move for a long time, and eventually Caruso had gotten out of the car and walked up the sidewalk and stood beside him without saying anything, because Caruso was a professional, and he understood the difference between a man who needed information and a man who needed a minute. Nico needed several minutes. The note was handwritten on a torn page from the notebook she kept beside the register. Her handwriting, certain, no crossings out. I'm sorry. Don't look for me. V. He read it 4 times. Not because the words were complicated, but because the mind does that. Returns to the thing that doesn't make sense and reads it again and again, as if repetition might produce a different meaning. It didn't. Drive, he said. Caruso drove. They went nowhere in particular for 20 minutes, through the Friday afternoon city, and Nico sat in the back seat with the note in his hand and the April light cutting hard through the window and his jaw doing the tight thing and his hands doing nothing, just flat on his thighs, very still, which was the stillness of a man who was containing something that would be damaging if it got out. He called her phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was calm and professional. He did not leave a message. He called again, same. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and sat. Where to? Caruso said at a red light. Nico thought about that. Where the question led him was not to a place but to a person, the person who knew, the person who would have seen this coming, the person who, if Nico was reading the situation correctly, had either caused it or known it was going to happen and said nothing. Pelham, he said. Sal was in the kitchen when Nico walked in without knocking. He was making coffee. The particular domestic normalcy of it, Sal Moretti in a cardigan at 6 in the evening, measuring grounds into a filter, hit Nico like a specific kind of insult. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his uncle, and Sal turned around and read whatever was in Nico's face and set the coffee down. Sit down, Sal said. Tell me what you did. Nico, what did you do? Not loud. The quiet version. The version that Sal had heard before and knew the specific gravity of. Sal pulled out a chair and sat down himself. He put his hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at Nico, and his face was doing something that was trying to be calm, but was really the expression of a man who has been waiting for a moment to arrive, and now that it has arrived, finds it worse than he'd prepared for. Sit down, he said again. Please. Nico sat. He put the note on the table between them. Sal looked at it without touching it. She left, Nico said. I know. 2 words. The specific weight of them landed across the table like something thrown. Nico looked at his uncle and felt the knowledge arrive before the words did. The knowledge that the thing he'd thought was a maybe was a certainty, that the question was not whether Sal had been involved, but what the shape of it was. How do you know? Nico said. Sal was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was the kitchen Nico had grown up in, more or less. The same yellow walls, the same old clock above the stove, the smell of coffee and old wood. He'd sat at this table 100 times. He'd learned things at this table. He'd been told his father was dying at this table. He sat at it now and felt every version of it stack up behind this one. Because, Sal said, and then stopped, started again. Because there was a conversation with Rosa about, we made contact with her, Nico, with Vivian. The room did something, not physically. The air in it changed. You contacted her, Nico said. Rosa did, through an intermediary. Rosa wrote her a letter. What kind of letter? Sal's hands moved on the table, a small involuntary adjustment. The kind that explained the situation, the full situation, what was happening with Soto and Marco, what the Ferrara people were saying, the actual risk profile, Nico, what it would mean going forward if she stayed, what people were capable of, specific people. He met Nico's eyes, what they had already done, the lease situation, the review, what Marco had been coordinating with Soto's people. Nico's chest was very still. He breathed through it slowly, without showing it on his face. You told her what Marco was doing. We told her what she was in the middle of. We told her the truth. The truth. He said the word back slowly, tasting it, finding it wrong. You told her enough to make her afraid, enough to make her think leaving was protecting me. Sal didn't answer. That's what you told her. Nico's voice had dropped further. Not because it was the truth, because you knew her well enough. Someone knew her well enough to know that the thing that would make her leave wasn't threatening her. It was making her believe that staying was hurting me. Sal's face did not change, which was an answer. Nico pushed back from the table. He stood. He turned and put both hands on the kitchen counter and looked at the window above the sink, which showed the backyard in the failing April light, the bare trees, the old fence. He breathed. Who wrote the letter? He said. Rosa drafted it. I reviewed it. You reviewed it. Nico, you sat down and you read a letter designed to manipulate a woman into leaving my life, and you decided that was acceptable. He turned around. You decided that was a thing you could do. Sal's expression shifted. It moved out of careful and into something more honest, which was the expression of a man who believes he did the right thing and is struggling with the fact that the right thing has a cost he hadn't fully priced. I decided that protecting you was... I didn't ask for that. You don't always get to decide what protection looks like. In my life, I do. Not when you can't see clearly. Sal's voice came up, not to a shout. Sal didn't shout, but it came up with the force of something that had been held down for months. Nico, I have watched you build something over 5 years that your father could not have built in 20. I have watched you make decisions that kept people alive, that kept this family together, that turned a situation that was falling apart into something with a future. And then I watched you walk into a bookstore and stop seeing the board. I see the board. You stopped sleeping correctly. You started arriving late to things. Not by much, 5 minutes, 10. But you, Nico, you who are never late to anything, that's not... You turned down the Westchester meeting in February because you had plans. Sal stood. They were the same height, more or less, same eyes, family eyes. You had plans. Nico Moretti, who has never in 5 years turned down a strategic meeting because he had plans. He let that sit. That's what I saw. That's what Rosa saw. That's what everyone around this table saw, and what your enemies saw too, and what they were starting to organize around. Nico looked at his uncle. He felt, in his chest, the specific texture of an argument he couldn't win with facts, because the facts Sal had weren't wrong, and the specific fury of a man who has been managed, who has been handled, by people who loved him, which is the most disorienting kind of management because the love is real. You had no right, he said. I know that, Sal said. And his voice when he said it was the voice of a man who meant it, who had known it before he did it and had done it anyway, which was its own kind of answer. I know I had no right. I made a decision that wasn't mine to make, and I made it because I didn't see another way. There were other ways. Name one that worked. Nico had no answer for that, not one he could say out loud, because the answer that was true was, I would have chosen her over the other ways. And they both knew that, and that was the whole of it. That was the architecture of what had happened, the reason Rosa had written the letter, the reason Sal had reviewed it, the reason Vivian had read it and opened the notebook and written 2 words and taped them to the glass. She had understood what Nico would choose. She had loved him enough to take the choice away from him. He picked up the note from the table. He put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at his uncle for a long moment. Find me a name, he said. Someone who knows where she went. Nico, not a request. He walked out of the kitchen. He walked out of the house. He got in the car and Caruso drove, and the April evening came down over the city, and Nico sat in the back seat with his hand in his jacket pocket, his fingers touching the folded edge of the note, and he thought about the specific shape of what had been done, not by enemies, by family. by the people who were supposed to be the ones he could trust absolutely, and who had taken an action against his life, against the person in his life, and dressed it in the language of protection until it looked like love. He thought about Vivian reading that letter. He thought about what it would have said. Sal's language, careful, specific, the language of a man who had been in difficult rooms for 40 years, wrapped around Rose's understanding of what a woman like Vivian would respond to. Not threats, evidence. The real risk, laid out with documentation. Here is what has already happened to you. Here is what is being planned. Here is what it will cost him if you stay. And here's what they are prepared to do to make sure you know it. She would have read it once. She would have read it again. She would have opened the notebook. He pressed his fingers against the folded note and breathed and let himself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the full weight of it, the specific grief of it, the cold, furious reality of it. And then he put it away. Not gone. Contained. He would come back to the feeling later in private, where it belonged. Right now what he needed was the other thing, the thing he was better at, the thing that had made him, at 28, the man sitting in the back seat of this car. He needed to find her. And before that, he needed to find out everything. It took him 4 days. 4 days of pulling on threads, of calling people who owed him information, of sitting in rooms and asking questions with the particular patience of someone who already knows the shape of the answer and is collecting the proof. Caruso drove. Nico asked. People answered, because when Nico Moretti asked questions with that specific quality of patience, the alternative to answering was a calculation nobody wanted to make. What he learned, in pieces, over 4 days. Rosa had contacted Vivian through a woman named Diane who ran an alteration shop 2 blocks from the bookstore and who had no connection to the family and would not have known what she was carrying. She delivered the letter by hand, said it was from a mutual acquaintance, and left. Vivian had been alone in the store when she read it. This was a Thursday. She'd locked the store the following evening. The letter had been written over 2 drafts. Sal had not just reviewed it, he had suggested the section about Marco and Soto, which was the section most likely to convince Vivian that staying was a strategic liability rather than just a personal one. Sal understood her. He'd spent 4 months watching Nico come home from that bookstore, and he'd understood with the intelligence of someone who had known Nico his whole life what kind of woman could make him feel the way he'd been feeling. He knew it wasn't fear that would move her. He knew it was responsibility. Marco had known the letter was being written. He had not written it and had not sent it, but he had known. And he had said nothing to Nico, and when the opportunity to say nothing presented itself, he had taken it with both hands. Soto had been told, through Marco, that the situation with Vivian was being resolved internally. Soto had taken this as confirmation that the family was managing its own instability, which he had further taken as confirmation that the instability was real and that his cultivation of Marco was bearing something. He'd scheduled a dinner for the following week with 2 men from the Ferrara organization. Nico sat with all of this. He assembled it the way he assembled everything. Not emotionally, not yet, but structurally, looking at the lines between the pieces and following them to where they led. Where they led was here. His uncle and his aunt had manipulated the woman he loved out of his life. His cousin had known and stayed silent. And Soto, reading this as weakness, was currently in the process of building a coalition designed to destabilize his leadership. These were not separate problems. They were the same problem with the same center, and the center was the night he'd walked into a bookstore on West 114th Street and bought a book about cartography. He called his uncle on the 4th day. "Come to the office," he said. "Bring Marco." "Nico, I think we should talk." "I said come to the office." They came. Sal and Marco arrived together, which told him they'd been talking. They'd been managing their story, which was the thing people did when they knew they were about to be in a room with someone who had more information than they'd expected. He watched them come through the door and sit down, and he read the specific quality of their composure. Sal's careful, Marco's forced, and he let them sit with the silence for a moment before he spoke. "I know everything," he said. "The letter, the drafts, Diane at the alteration shop. I know Marco knew. I know about the dinner with Soto last week." He paused. "I know about the one scheduled for next week." Marco's face went through several things quickly. Sal's did not change. You want to tell me your version, Nico said, or do you want to start with what we're going to do about it? Sal said, I'd like to explain. I don't need an explanation. I have the facts. Nico stood. He moved to the window. The city was below, mid-morning, gray sky, traffic. He kept his back to them for a moment, which was deliberate. It was the posture of a man who was not afraid of the room behind him. What I need from this conversation is clarity about going forward. So I'll tell you what I see, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong. He turned around. You went outside the family to manage a situation inside my life, he said. You used a civilian intermediary. You wrote a letter that leveraged my relationship's most private dynamics, what she cares about, what she responds to achieve a result I had explicitly told you I didn't want. You did all of this without my knowledge and with the specific intention of presenting me with a result rather than a decision. He looked at them. That's not protection. That's control. Sal started to speak. Nico kept going. And you, to Marco now, and something in his voice changed. A register dropped that was not anger exactly, but was what lived underneath it, something colder. You sat in a parking garage and called Vincent Soto and told him the situation was being resolved. You fed our internal situation to an outside operator. You didn't invite him in, you didn't take money, but you gave him information. And information is currency in this world, Marco, and you spent it. He paused. You spent it to protect yourself. Because if Vivian was gone and the situation was resolved, your role in creating the situation was easier to obscure. Marco's jaw was tight. That's not... I was trying to... Don't. One word. Marco stopped. Don't tell me what you were trying to do. Tell me what you did. The silence was long and bad. I told him it was being handled, Marco said finally. His voice was flat. The voice of someone who has given up on the version of the story that made him look better. I told him the family was managing the situation. I didn't give him strategy. I didn't tell him anything operational. You told him we were divided, Nico said. That's everything he needed. Marco looked at the floor. Nico looked at Sal. You're not wrong that I was distracted, he said. You're not wrong that she was a vulnerability point. You're not wrong about any of the strategic analysis. He let that sit. But you went around me, in my own family. You made a decision about my life that was mine to make, and you dressed it in strategy so you didn't have to call it what it was. What was it? Sal said. His voice was steady. He was not a man who broke easily, Sal Moretti, and even now he held himself with the specific uprightness of someone who believed, in some chamber of himself, that he'd done the right thing. You decided she wasn't good enough, Nico said. That's what it was. Not strategy, not protection. You decided that a 48-year-old woman who owns a bookstore wasn't the right thing for me to want, and when I didn't agree, you removed her. He kept his voice even, kept it exact. Call it what it is. Sal's jaw moved. Something moved behind his eyes. I decided, Sal said, that she was going to get hurt, that someone was going to use her to get to you, and that when that happened, she would pay the price, and that you would have to live with having brought her into it. He stopped, breathed. I was trying to prevent that. By doing it yourself, Nico said, by hurting her yourself first, in a way I couldn't see and she couldn't fight. The room was very quiet. Marco looked up. His face had something in it that was uncomfortable with itself. The expression of a man who had been so busy managing his own position that he hadn't fully traced the shape of what he'd participated in, and was only now, sitting in this office, beginning to. What are you going to do? Sal said. Nico looked at his uncle for a long moment. 61 years old. In this family since before Nico was born. The man who had sat at his father's bedside and then sat at Nico's and transferred the weight of the thing between them. The man who had reviewed a letter and told himself it was protection. I'm going to find her, Nico said. And before I do that, I'm going to deal with Marco's situation with Soto, because that can't wait. And then I'm going to make some changes to how this organization operates that are long overdue. He paused. And you and I are going to have a longer conversation about boundaries, Sal. about what is and isn't yours to manage in my life. But not tonight. He picked up his keys. Marco, he said, you're done with Soto. That ends today. You don't take calls, you don't respond to messages, and if he shows up somewhere you are, you leave. You come to me and tell me about it within the hour. Marco nodded, tight. Something in him was relieved, which was the specific relief of a man who has been given a clear instruction after a period of having operated without one. And I want the letter, Nico said. Sal looked at him. The letter Rosa wrote, the drafts, whatever copies exist, I want them. Nico, what good does I want them. A beat. Then Sal reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. It had been folded. It had been carried. He'd had it with him. Nico took it. He didn't open it. He put it in his pocket with the note from the door. He left. He read the letter in the car. Caruso drove. Nico read. It was 3 pages, handwritten in Rosa's script, which was precise and schooled and nothing like Vivian's angular clarity. It was, as he'd known it would be, extremely well done. It didn't threaten, it didn't insult. It laid out facts, documented, specific, the kind of facts that are worse than insults because they don't require interpretation. The lease situation and the source of it. The review and the IP address it had been traced to. The 2 women in February and whose car they'd arrived in. The dinner Marco had had with Soto and what had been said at it, in enough detail that Vivian would understand it had come from inside the family, that this was not speculation. And then the last page. The last page was Rosa's understanding of Nico, of what he would choose if it came to a choice. Not written with cruelty, written with the specific accuracy of a woman who had known him since he was 8 years old and had watched him become the man he was. She wrote about his capacity for loyalty, about the thing that drove him. She wrote, in clear, careful prose, that if Vivian stayed, Nico would protect her, and that the cost of that protection would be a sustained fracture within the family, and that the fracture would be exploited by people who were already positioned to do so, and that people would get hurt, not Vivian specifically, but people around them both, people who had not chosen to be in the radius of this, and that Nico would spend the rest of his life carrying that. It was a portrait of him, accurate, used against him by people who loved him. He folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat with it for a moment. What he felt, sitting in the moving car with the envelope in his hand and the city outside, was something that had no clean name. Betrayal was part of it, but not all of it, because betrayal required malice, and what Sal and Rosa had done didn't have malice in it. It had something worse. Love organized badly, care expressed as control, protection that became its own kind of wound. He felt the specific cold of that, the way it was harder to fight than open hostility because it didn't give you a clean target. And underneath that, deeper, was the feeling of reading 3 pages of Rosa's understanding of Vivian, her intelligence, her integrity, the specific quality of her that had made her impossible to threaten directly. And knowing that Rosa had understood all of that, had seen all of that, and had used it anyway, had aimed directly at the thing that made Vivian Vivian and pulled. He thought about Vivian reading this letter alone in the store. He thought about her face doing that containing expression. He thought about her opening the notebook. He took out his phone. He called the number he'd been given by Polly, the number of a woman named Terry who worked at a storage facility in the Bronx and who had, according to Polly, helped Vivian move several boxes the afternoon of the day she'd left. Terry answered on the first ring. She confirmed she knew Vivian. She confirmed the boxes. She said, after a silence that cost Nico a number that made it a business conversation rather than an intrusion, that Vivian had mentioned her daughter in Portland, that she'd said something about needing to be somewhere quiet for a while. Portland. He called an associate who had contacts at 2 airlines. He didn't want flight manifests. That was too slow and too loud. He wanted something simpler. Did the name Vivian Brooks appear on a departure in the last 4 days on any westbound route? She'd flown to Portland on Saturday morning, 2 days after the note on the door. He sat with that. She'd packed boxes on Friday, left them at storage, flown to Portland on Saturday. She'd been organized about it. She'd had a plan. She'd known she was going, and she'd taken care of what needed to be taken care of before she went. That was Vivian. Even in the most wrenching decision of her life, she'd been organized. He felt something in his chest pull tight and then release, like a muscle that had been held too long. He breathed through it. He was going to go to Portland, but not yet. Not like this, so not reactive. Not arriving at her door with nothing changed, asking her to come back to the same situation. She hadn't left because she was afraid. She'd left because she'd believed she was protecting him. And the only thing that would make her reconsider that belief was evidence that the thing she'd sacrificed herself to protect was actually different now. That the choice she'd made had changed something real. He couldn't give her that tonight. Tonight, he had to do what should have been done months ago. What he'd been managing around, keeping in careful balance, telling himself he could hold without forcing a reckoning. He had to stop holding and start breaking. He told Caruso to go to the restaurant in Bensonhurst where Don Enzo Calabrese ate dinner every Friday without variation. Enzo was on his second glass of wine when Nico sat down across from him. The restaurant was small and old and the kind of place that had not changed its menu since 1978. The owner knew better than to seat anyone near Enzo's table when Enzo was there, so they were effectively alone in a corner of the room with the noise of the kitchen and the distant sound of other diners and the wine and the bread on the table. Enzo looked at Nico the way he looked at everything, from a position of accumulated patience, the specific unhurried quality of a man who had seen many things arrive and more things pass. "You look like your father," Enzo said, when he'd made up his mind about something. "I've made up my mind about something," Nico said. "Tell me." Nico told him. Not everything, not the letter, not the full catalog of what Marco had done, but the shape of it. The shape of what was going to change, and how, and what he needed from Enzo, which was not approval. What he needed from Enzo was witness. The specific weight of the old man's presence at a decision, which gave it a different order of reality in the world they operated in. Enzo listened. He broke a piece of bread. He chewed it slowly and looked at the table. "You're going to remove Marco from the table," he said. "From certain conversations, yes. That will look like... I know what it will look like. His father, I know." Enzo was quiet for a moment. "And Soto." "Soto gets one communication," Nico said. "Clear language. The approach to Marco is closed. If he wants a conversation with the Moretti family, he comes to me through established channels. If he continues to operate around that, I treat it as the act it is." Enzo looked at him. His eyes, behind all the accumulated patience, were still sharp, still measuring. "And the woman?" Nico looked back at him. "That's my business." "It's been everyone's business for 6 months, Nico. It's going to stop being everyone's business." Enzo picked up his wine. He turned the glass in his hand. "Your father, when he met your mother, the family didn't want it either. You know that. She was from outside the world, the wrong kind of outside, not enough money, not enough connection. They wanted someone else for him." He set the glass down. "He told them the same thing you're telling me now, and he was right." A pause. "He was also lucky, which is not the same thing as right, but sometimes they arrive together." "I don't need luck," Nico said. "I need to fix what's broken." Enzo nodded slowly. "Then fix it. But do it in the right order. Fix what's broken here first. Don't go to Portland with this still open behind you." "I know the order," Nico said. He stood. He offered his hand and Enzo shook it with the dry grip of a man who had shaken many hands and would shake fewer going forward. "There's one more thing," Enzo said, before Nico could turn away. His voice had changed, dropped a register. The thing underneath the patience, visible now. "Soto's dinner next week with the Ferrara people." He paused. "I've heard what's on the table. It's not just a conversation about positioning, Nico. They're talking about something more direct." Nico went still. "How direct?" Enzo looked at him. The kind that doesn't leave room for a response. The room did what rooms did when language arrived that meant a thing it couldn't say plainly. The background noise continued. A waiter moved through the distant dining room. The candle on the table moved in a draft from somewhere. "Who's the source?" Nico said. "Someone who owes me a debt older than you are," Enzo said. "Someone whose information has been reliable since 1991. He met Nico's eyes. "I would not tell you something like this on unreliable information." Nico sat back down. He sat at the table in the small restaurant in Bensonhurst, and he laid the new information on top of everything else he'd been carrying, and he felt the weight of it, the full, specific, impossible weight of being the man in the room that everything converged on, the man who had to hold all of it and still make decisions that were right. Soto wasn't just trying to destabilize him through Marco. Soto was coordinating with the Ferrara people on something terminal, and they'd scheduled it for next week, which meant they'd been planning it for longer than that, which meant the decision had been made, probably, around the time they'd first seen the family fracture beginning. Around the time a young boss had started spending his afternoons in a bookstore on West 114th Street, and his family had started to come apart around him. He had caused this, not by loving Vivian, by loving her in a world that watched for weakness and called everything weakness that didn't look like stone. He sat for a long time. Then he stood. "I need a name," he said. "The person at the dinner. The Ferrara side." Enzo gave him the name. Nico walked out of the restaurant into the April night. The city was loud and cold and indifferent and going in every direction at once. He stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, and he felt, for the first time in 5 years, something that he identified with a cold clarity as fear. Not for himself, but for the specific way the future had just narrowed, the way the board had reorganized itself while he was looking at the wrong squares, and the recognition that the person he'd sent to Portland was sitting in her daughter's house, not knowing that the thing she'd left to prevent was arriving anyway, on a timeline that had nothing to do with her choice. She'd left to keep him safe. And in leaving, she'd given his enemies exactly what they'd been waiting for. The confirmation that he was fractured, that the blow had landed, that the moment to move was now. He took out his phone. He did not call Vivian. Not yet. Not tonight, with the new information raw and the path forward not yet clear. He called Caruso. "I need you to reach out to the people we trust," he said. "The inner circle only. Tell them we're meeting tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, the East Side office." A pause. "And Caruso, don't tell Sal." A beat of silence from the front seat, then, "Understood." Nico put the phone away. He stood on the sidewalk for one more moment. He thought about Vivian in Portland, about the letter Rosa had written, and the note on the door, and the specific sound of the voicemail recording that was her voice being professional and calm. He thought about what Enzo had said. Fix what's broken here first. He was going to do that. He was going to do that with everything he had, with the full machinery of what he'd built, and who he was, and the cold specific intelligence that had made him the man in the room that everything converged on. He was going to do it right, and he was going to do it fast, and he was going to make it mean something that could be seen from Portland. But first, he had to walk into the worst version of the thing. He'd been... The 7 o'clock meeting had 9 people in it. Nico had called 8. The 9th was Paulie, who showed up because Paulie always showed up when things were moving, the way certain animals sense weather before instruments do. Nobody told him to leave. He stood near the door with his coat still on and his hands in his pockets, and he listened, and his presence was the kind of presence that doesn't need explanation. The East Side office at 7 in the morning had the specific quality of a room that has been used for serious things. The furniture was functional, the windows faced east, and the April morning light came through flat, and without warmth, and laid itself across the table in pale rectangles. Nico stood at the head of the table. He had not slept. This was visible in the set of his shoulders, and not visible in his face, which was the face he wore in rooms like this. Level, specific, without temperature. He laid it out in 20 minutes. Not everything. The essentials. What Enzo had told him. The dinner next week. The Ferrara connection. The timeline. The fact that Soto had been building towards something terminal rather than something strategic, and that Marco's inadvertent information had accelerated a schedule that might otherwise have taken another 6 months to arrive. He watched the faces around the table. These were men who had worked with him long enough to know the difference between a briefing and a declaration. This was a declaration. "What we're going to do," he said, "is get ahead of it. We're not going to wait for their meeting. We're going to move before it happens, and we're going to move in a way that closes the question permanently." He paused. "Not through the kind of response they're planning, through something they're not built to defend against." Paulie said from the door, "What kind of something?" The kind that uses their own exposure against them, Nico said. Soto has been operating across a line for 3 years. There's documented evidence of it, the kind of evidence that would interest the federal authorities significantly. Evidence that has been sitting in a specific place, held by a specific person, because the timing was never right to use it. He looked around the table. The timing is right now. The room took this in. A man named Benedetti, who handled the family's legal architecture and who had the specific pallor of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms with no windows, said, "You're talking about a submission." "I'm talking about a strategic disclosure," Nico said. "Managed. Through the right channel, in a way that takes Soto off the board before next week and makes the Ferrara people recalculate whether the alliance is worth what it's suddenly going to cost them. If this comes back to us as the source, it won't. The channel I'm using has a wall between us and it that's been in place for 8 years. It was built for exactly this situation." He looked at Benedetti. "This is why we built it." Benedetti nodded slowly. The nod of a man doing rapid calculations and finding that the math worked, which was sometimes the best you could ask for. The meeting ended at 8:30. People left in pairs and alone, the way they'd arrived. Paulie was last. He paused at the door and looked at Nico with the assessing eyes of a man who had seen many situations and knew which ones had more moving parts than the briefing had covered. "The personal situation," Paulie said. "Not a question." "Handle the professional situation first," Nico said. Paulie left. Nico sat alone in the East Side office at 8:30 in the morning with the flat April light on the table and his phone in his hand. He looked at Vivian's number. He did not call it. He put the phone down. He picked up the documents Benedetti had left. A folder, organized, the legal architecture of what was about to happen, laid out in language that was dry and exact, and nothing like the human reality underneath it. He read it. He initialed 3 pages. He put it back in the folder. Then he called the man named Carver. Carver was not a name anyone around the table this morning would have recognized, which was by design. He was a former federal investigator who had, after 22 years, reached the conclusion that the institutional version of justice was a slower and less reliable mechanism than certain private alternatives, and who now operated in a specific and lucrative gap between the two. He had worked with the Moretti family on 3 prior occasions, always at a distance, always behind the wall that Benedetti had referenced, always in a way that left no fingerprint that pointed anywhere except toward the truth of what was being disclosed. He answered on the second ring. Nico said, "It's time." Carver said, "I'll need 48 hours. "You have 36. A pause. "That's tight." "I know what tight is," Nico said. 36. "Done," Carver said. The 36 hours were the longest kind. Nico did not sleep Tuesday night. He worked. He moved through the architecture of what was being assembled. Legal, strategic, the careful positioning of pieces that needed to be in specific places before the mechanism was activated. He ate once, standing over the kitchen counter in his apartment, something cold from the refrigerator that he didn't register tasting. He drank coffee. He made calls. He also, at 2 in the morning on Wednesday, sat down at his kitchen table with the letter from Rosa and the note from the door, and he read them both again. He read the note first, still 2 sentences. "I'm sorry. Don't look for me." The handwriting that he knew now. The clear angular script that wrote book orders. And that one line in January, and now this. He read the letter second. All 3 pages. He read it the way he'd read it the first time, with the specific attention of a man reading something that has already happened to him, looking for the thing he missed. He didn't find anything new. It was still extremely well done. Rosa understood Vivian in the way that intelligent women sometimes understand other intelligent women, with a precision that has the quality of a knife. He folded both of them. He put them in the inner pocket of his jacket, where they'd been since Friday. At 3 in the morning, he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He sat in the dark of his apartment and he let himself think about the future. Not tactically, not the board, just the actual future. The shape of the years forward, what he wanted them to contain, what he was willing to burn to get there. The answer he arrived at was simple, and had been simple for months, and the only thing that had changed was that he was saying it to himself plainly now, without the management language he normally wrapped around things that were too direct to be comfortable. He wanted Vivian Brooks. He wanted the bookstore on Tuesday afternoons and the yellow lamp at the reading table and the eggs at 4 in the afternoon in the diner on Broadway. He wanted the specific quality of being known by someone who had nothing to gain from knowing him. He wanted to come home to a person who laughed in private at jokes she was having with herself and who would tell him when he was wrong and who had spent 11 years building a life that suited exactly her, in which he was the only thing that had arrived without being planned for. He wanted that. The rest, the restructuring he was going to do, the corrections to the organization, the removal of the people who had made themselves liabilities, that was necessary regardless, and he would do it regardless. It was overdue. He'd known it was overdue. The situation with Vivian had not created the problems in the family. It had simply made them visible, the way pressure finds existing cracks. But the restructuring alone was not enough. It was necessary and not sufficient. Because the question Vivian had asked him back in October, "What are you going to do about the people around you?" was not fully answered by removing Marco from certain conversations and handling Soto through legal architecture and having a boundary-setting talk with Sal. The full answer was harder than that. The full answer was that he had to change the way the organization worked at a structural level, not just remove the bad actors, because the structure itself, the way power flowed, the way decisions were made, the way the people around him related to his personal life as though it were organizational property, was the thing that had produced the letter and the note on the door. He sat with that until 4 in the morning. Then he got up and went back to work. Wednesday afternoon, Vincent Soto received a phone call from his attorney. Nico was not on that call. He was in his office, 3 miles away, reading a contract that needed his signature for reasons entirely unrelated to the current situation. He was reading it with the focused attention of a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in a crisis was stop attending to the normal operations of your life, because the normal operations of your life were the evidence that you were still standing. The call lasted 11 minutes. Nico knew this because Carver texted him the duration, which was the signal they'd agreed on. After the call, Soto made 4 calls of his own. Nico knew the first 3 recipients. The fourth was a name he didn't recognize, which meant it was Soto's personal attorney rather than the family one, which meant Soto was doing his own private calculation about his exposure. The dinner for next week was canceled before 6 o'clock Wednesday evening. Nico received this information from Carver in a text that said simply, "Postponed indefinitely." He read the text. He put the phone down. He looked at the unsigned contract on his desk for a moment, and then he picked up the pen and signed it and put it in the out tray. He called Benedetti. "It worked," Benedetti said before Nico could speak. "First stage," Nico said. "The second stage is the meeting with the Ferrara organization." "That's more complicated." "I know. When can you be ready?" "Thursday. Friday is better." "Thursday," Nico said. "Thursday," Benedetti said. "Nico." A pause. The pause of a man choosing whether to say something. "This is what you're doing, the scope of it, the restructuring you've been describing. There are people in this family, not Marco, not Sal, but people further out who are going to see this as a significant departure." "It is a significant departure," Nico said. "They'll push back. They can push back to me directly. That's the point." He paused. "That's always been the point." Thursday morning, the meeting with the Ferrara organization. It was held on neutral ground, a conference room in a building in Midtown that Benedetti's law firm occupied 2 floors of, a building that had the specific anonymity of a place that existed to hold conversations that couldn't be held elsewhere. Nico arrived first. He sat at the head of the table and he reviewed his notes, not to remember what was in them, but because the act of sitting with material before a critical meeting was a practice he'd had since his early 20s, the way athletes warm up not because they need to, but because their body knows the ritual. Dominic Ferrara arrived with 2 people. One was his attorney. One was the man whose name Enzo had given Nico in the restaurant in Bensonhurst, a man named Iacovelli, who handled the Ferrara family's external relationships, and who had the smooth, careful face of someone who had spent decades saying difficult things pleasantly. They sat down. Coffee was poured. The pleasantries were brief and acknowledged to be brief by both sides, which was itself a form of mutual respect. Dominic Ferrara was 64, built like a man who had been physically formidable at 40 and had kept the posture of it without keeping the body. He had the eyes of someone who had made many calculations and found most of them to be correct, which produced a specific kind of confidence that was not arrogance because it was grounded. He looked at Nico across the table and said, "We should talk about the Soto situation." "We should," Nico said. "I understand there was a development yesterday." "A significant one," Ferrara nodded. He folded his hands on the table. The arrangement Soto was proposing, I want to be clear about this, was not something I had formally committed to. "I know that," Nico said, which was partly true. What he knew was that Ferrara had been listening, had been open, had allowed Iacovelli to attend 2 conversations. That was not formal commitment. It was also not nothing. "I'm not here to discuss what you committed to. I'm here to discuss what comes next." Ferrara's eyes adjusted slightly. The look of a man who had expected to spend the first 20 minutes of this meeting defending his position and was now recalibrating toward a different kind of conversation. "What comes next?" he said. "I'm restructuring the organization," Nico said. "The internal situation that made this family look unstable, that's being addressed, directly and permanently." He paused. "The people who created the appearance of a fractured leadership are being removed from decision-making. The external approach that Soto was using is being closed. What I'm offering to the Ferrara family is a conversation about what a normalized relationship looks like going forward, not the relationship we had last year, which was adequate, but something more structured, more direct." Ferrara was quiet for a moment. Iacovelli was looking at the table in the way of someone who is processing something faster than his face is showing. "Why?" Ferrara said. Simple word. Direct. "Because this family is going to be here in 20 years, Nico said. And in 20 years, the organizations that are still functioning are going to be the ones that solve the structural problems instead of managing around them. I'd rather build a relationship with your family based on that reality than spend the next decade in the kind of positioning that benefits Soto and his people more than either of us." Ferrara looked at him for a long time. The look that had been calculating and protective was doing something more complex now. "My wife spoke to the woman," Ferrara said, eventually. "Vivian Brooks." Nico kept his face level. "I know. Gabriella said she was not what she'd expected. She's not what most people expect." Ferrara made a sound that might have been the beginning of something. He covered it with a hand over his mouth, briefly, which was as close as a man like that got to showing you what he was actually thinking. "She left," he said. "She left. And you." "I'm handling things," Nico said, "in the right order." Ferrara nodded slowly. He looked at his folded hands for a moment, then he looked up. "There's a third thing we should talk about. The matter of Soto's continued operation in Westchester." He paused. "Given the development yesterday, his position is significantly weakened. There's a question of what fills that space." They talked for 90 minutes. When they were done, Iacovelli gathered his papers with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that what had just happened was significant and needed to be treated as such. Ferrara stood and extended his hand, and Nico shook it, and the quality of the handshake was different from what it would have been at the beginning of the meeting, which was the whole point. At the door, Ferrara paused. He didn't turn all the way around. He said, toward the doorframe, "When you find her, the woman." He stopped. "Don't go with empty hands." Nico said nothing. Ferrara left. Nico sat back down at the conference table. The coffee cups were half empty. The morning light through the midtown windows was doing something that was almost warm. He sat there for 3 minutes, which was longer than he usually sat anywhere alone, and he let the weight of the last 4 days move through him. Not settle, not resolve, but move, the way the body processes something physical by working it through rather than holding it still. Then he stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his phone, and he called Sal. "What?" Sal answered on the first ring. He'd been waiting, which Nico had known he would be. Sal Moretti, in a state of uncertainty, was a man near a phone. "We need to meet," Nico said. "Not the office, the house." Sal said, "Tonight?" "Now." He drove to Pelham again. The same bare trees in the yard, less bare now. It was later in April, and the beginnings of leaves were on the branches, small and uncertain, the way early April leaves always were. He sat in the car for a moment and looked at them and then got out. Sal was in the sitting room. Rosa was there too. Nico had expected that. He sat down across from both of them and he set his jacket on the arm of the chair, and he looked at his aunt and uncle and he felt, looking at them, the full complexity of what they were to him. The people who had been at every significant event of his life, who had loved him in the specific way of people who didn't have the vocabulary for it and expressed it through presence and management instead, and who had done the most damaging thing that had happened to him in 5 years, and had done it because they thought they were protecting him. He said, "I need to tell you some things, and then I need you to listen to what's going to change." They listened. He told them about the Soto situation, the full shape of it, including what Enzo had told him, including what had been done in the last 36 hours. He watched Sal's face process the information about the terminal plan, the genuine shock of it, which told him that Sal had known the family was vulnerable, but had not known the degree to which the vulnerability had been exploited. Sal was many things, but he was not someone who would have watched Nico walk into that and said nothing. He told them about the Ferrara meeting, the restructuring, the people being removed from certain roles. Marco's new position, which was further from the decision-making center and would feel, to Marco, like a demotion, and which was a demotion. Rosa listened with her hands folded in her lap. Her face was doing something that was trying to be composed and was not entirely succeeding, which was unusual for Rosa, who had composure the way other people had furniture, installed early and rarely moved. When he was done, Sal said, "You're angry." "I'm past angry," Nico said. "Angry was last Friday night. What I am now is clear." "What does clear mean?" "It means I'm not asking permission for what I'm doing. I'm telling you what it is because you're family and you deserve to know. And because some of what I'm doing addresses a problem that you helped create. And I want you to understand that." He looked at his uncle. "I also want you to understand that I'm not done with the conversation about the letter. Not today. Today is about the operational changes, but we're going to have that conversation, Sal, about what you thought you had the right to do and where that comes from and what it means for how this family works. That conversation is coming." Sal nodded, the nod of a man accepting something. "And Rosa," Nico said. He looked at his aunt. She looked back at him with the eyes that gave away everything if you knew how to read them. And what they were giving away now was something that was not quite guilt. Rosa was too contained for guilt in its raw form, but was the specific discomfort of a person who had done something correct by their own logic and was sitting with the possibility that their logic had a flaw. "The letter," he said. "I know," she said. "You understood her," he said. "You read her right. You knew exactly what to say to make her go." He paused. "And you used that. You took the most accurate understanding you had of a person and you aimed it at her like a weapon." Rosa's jaw tightened, not in anger, in something more internal. "I was trying to protect you," she said. "I know that." "Nico." "I know that," he said again, and his voice had something in it that was not anger and not forgiveness, but was the place between them that required both to be present before anything could move. "That's what makes it—" He stopped, breathed. "That's what makes it the specific thing it is, that you loved me enough to do that, and that it was still wrong." Rosa looked at her hands. She was 60 years old and she had run the charitable arm of the Moretti family for 22 years, and she had buried her sister and raised 4 children and managed the social landscape of a world that did not allow for the kind of weakness that admitted error easily. Nico watched her sit with it. "Is she all right?" Rosa said. The question of a woman who had thought about the other woman after, who had wondered. "I don't know," Nico said. "I haven't spoken to her." When I'm done here," he said, "when the things that need to be done are done, that's when." Rosa nodded. She said nothing else, but something in her face had shifted. Some small internal door that had been held shut was less shut now. Nico noted it without responding to it. He stood. He put his jacket back on. He looked at both of them. Family doesn't stop, he said. That's not what this is. This is correction. This is me telling you where the lines are, finally, instead of managing around the places where we disagree. He picked up his keys. That's overdue. That's on me as much as anyone. He drove back to the city. Friday evening, Marco came to the office alone. He hadn't been summoned. Nico looked up from his desk when Caruso showed Marco in and read Marco's face. The specific configuration of a man who has spent a week with the full weight of his own actions and has arrived at something through that process, not through being told. Marco sat down. He didn't wait to be addressed. I want to say something, he said. Nico put down his pen. Go ahead. What I did with Soto. Marco stopped. His jaw worked. I told myself it was legitimate concern about the family, about the situation. I told myself I was raising concerns through an outside channel because the inside channel wasn't. He stopped again. That's not true. What's true is that I was protecting my position. I was angry about being passed over for the Westchester conversation in February, and Soto gave me a place to put that anger, and I let him. He looked at Nico. I let him use me, and I knew what he was doing, and I let him do it anyway because it felt better than admitting I was angry at you. Nico looked at his cousin, 31 years old, blood, the specific, complicated love of family. You almost got me killed, Nico said. The words landed. Marco did not look away from them. I know, he said, not through malice, through carelessness, through letting someone else manage your grievance because you weren't willing to bring it to me yourself. Nico's voice was even. That's not a small thing, Marco. I know it isn't. Do you understand what the dinner next week was? Marco's face shifted. Enzo told me. I asked him. He told me. His voice had something in it that was stripped of the usual performance. Raw material. I didn't know it had gone that far. When I talked to Soto, I thought it was positioning, not, it doesn't matter what you thought it was, Nico said. It matters what it was. What you fed matters based on what it fed, not based on what you intended. Marco sat with that. You're being moved, Nico said. The role changes. You know this. Yes. It's not permanent. If you do what I need you to do in the new role, and if you can come to me directly with concerns instead of finding another Soto, then we talk about what comes next. But that's not now. That's after. Marco nodded. He stood. He looked, standing there, younger than 31. The specific youth of someone who has just understood the full shape of a mistake they made without fully understanding it while they were making it. The woman, Marco said, at the door. He stopped. Vivian. He said her name the way someone says a name they've been avoiding saying. The two women I sent in February, what I said at those meetings. I was wrong about her. He paused. I was wrong about what she meant to you, and I was wrong about her as a person, based on nothing except... He stopped. I was wrong. Nico looked at him for a long moment. I know you were, he said. Marco left. Nico sat alone in the office for a moment. The building was quiet. End of the week, most people gone, just the building sounds and the city sounds coming through the walls. He looked at his desk, the unsigned things, the signed things, the architecture of a week that had been the hardest since the months after his father died. He looked at all of it and felt, under the exhaustion. And he was exhausted, a bone-specific tiredness that came from days of operating at full capacity on no sleep. Something that was not quite relief, but was the thing adjacent to it. The thing that arrives when you've done the thing you couldn't put off anymore and found out that the doing of it, while hard, was possible. He'd been carrying it for 6 months. The knowledge that the family had problems he was managing around instead of fixing. The relationships that had drifted into patterns that weren't working. The specific weight of being the person everything converged on, in a structure that didn't have clean lines of accountability, where his personal life was treated as organizational property because he'd never drawn the line that said it wasn't. He'd drawn it now. The cost had been high. The cost was still coming in. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the note and the letter. He held them for a moment. Then he stood, and he walked to the small garbage can near the window, and he dropped the letter in it. Rose's 3 pages. He didn't need them anymore. He knew what they said. He knew what they meant. He knew what had to happen because of them, and he'd started that process. And carrying the physical document forward served nothing. He kept the note. The 2 sentences in Vivian's handwriting. He put it back in his pocket. He picked up his phone. He called an airline. He booked a flight to Portland for Saturday morning, one way, because he didn't know how long he'd need and he wasn't going to guess. He called Caruso. "I need you to take care of things here, Wald," he said. "The follow-up from Benedetti on Monday, the call with the Ferrara people on Tuesday. You have what you need." "How long are you gone?" Caruso said. "However long it takes," Nico said. A pause. "Understood." He hung up. He sat in the quiet office. Outside, through the window, the Friday evening city was doing what it did, loud and indifferent and continuous, never pausing for the specific dramas taking place inside all of its buildings, never acknowledging that a man on the 17th floor had just spent the most difficult week of his life dismantling the structure of his own family's bad habits so that a woman in Portland would be able to believe, if he could get her to hear him, that the ground was different now. He sat there for a while. Then he went home and he packed a bag, and he set an alarm for 5 in the morning, and he lay down on his bed in the dark with his phone on the nightstand and his jacket over the chair and the note in the inner pocket where it had been all week, and he slept for the first time in 4 days, deeply and without interruption, the way the body sleeps when it has been given permission to stop holding everything up for a few hours. Portland was gray and wet on Saturday morning, the kind of gray that was specific to the Pacific Northwest. Not the gray of a New York winter, which was bleak and industrial, but a softer gray, the gray of a sky that was made of layers, each one slightly different. The rain was light. The streets near the airport were lined with Douglas firs that were doing nothing special and were nevertheless impressive, the way things that have simply grown without effort become impressive through scale. Nico had the address from Paulie, who had gotten it through the kind of patient information gathering that Paulie was extremely good at without ever doing anything dramatic. The daughter's name was Claire. She lived in a neighborhood called Selwood, in a house with a porch, in a street that was quiet in the way of streets where people had chosen to live away from noise. He had Caruso's equivalent in Portland, a man named Ortega, who handled the family's occasional West Coast situations, pick him up from the airport. He sat in the back of Ortega's car and looked at the wet Portland streets and did not talk. Ortega pulled up to the curb on the street in Selwood and stopped. Nico looked at the house. It was a craftsman bungalow, painted dark green, with a deep porch and a garden that was doing something organized and slightly overgrown at the same time. There were lights on inside, a lamp in the front window. He could see the shape of a chair through the glass, and a bookshelf, of course, a bookshelf, and the warm, specific quality of interior light against a gray Portland morning. He sat in the car. He was not, and this was not a small thing to acknowledge, entirely sure she would let him in. She'd left because she'd believed it was the right thing, and the version of the situation she knew did not yet include what had happened in the last week. He had the restructuring. He had the Soto situation resolved. He had the Ferrara relationship reoriented. He had the conversations with Sal and Rosa and Marco that had been years overdue. He had all of it, and he also had the knowledge that none of it was sufficient if she looked at him and heard an argument instead of a truth. He had told himself, on the flight, that he would not argue, that he would tell her what had happened and let her decide, that if she decided the answer was still no, he would accept that. Not because he wanted to, but because the specific way he felt about Vivian Brooks required that her choice be actually a choice, and choices made under pressure were not choices. He believed that. He also knew, sitting in the car outside the house, that the believing it and the doing it were going to require everything he had. He got out of the car. He walked up the path to the porch. The rain was still light. The Douglas firs on either side of the street were doing nothing special. He climbed the porch steps, and he stood at the door, and he raised his hand, and he knocked. And the sound of it was ordinary, the sound of a knuckle on painted wood, and he stood in the Portland rain and waited, and the door opened on the second knock. Not Vivian, a younger woman, Late 20s, dark hair, Vivian's eyes in a different face. Claire. She looked at Nico on the porch with the specific wariness of someone who had been told things and had spent 2 weeks being worried and was now looking at the source of the worry in the flesh. "She's here," Nico said. Not a question. Claire looked at him for a long moment. The rain continued, light and indifferent. Then she stepped back from the door. He walked in. The house was warm. It smelled like coffee and old wood, and something cooking somewhere in the back. Books on every surface. Claire had inherited that, or grown up in it, which was the same thing. The lamp in the front window was the one he'd seen from the car. A coat hung on a hook by the door that he recognized. The gray cardigan, the rust one's quieter cousin. He looked at it for a moment. Claire said from behind him, "She's in the kitchen." He walked toward the back of the house. The hallway was narrow, photographs on the walls. Claire at different ages, a younger Vivian with shorter hair and no silver in it, landscapes that were not New York. He moved through them without stopping and pushed open the kitchen door. Vivian was standing at the counter with a coffee cup in both hands, and she turned when the door opened and she looked at him. She did not look surprised. That told him something. She'd known, or suspected. She was too intelligent not to have considered the possibility that he'd find out Portland, that 2 weeks was enough time for him to find what he was looking for. She'd had time to prepare her face, and she'd chosen not to. What her face showed was what it showed when she was deciding something. Contained, present, the expression she wore when the conversation ahead required all of her. She looked tired. Not the desperate tiredness of someone in crisis, but the specific tiredness of someone who has been doing hard thinking for 2 weeks in a borrowed room, sleeping on someone else's schedule, living in the specific suspension of a decision not yet fully resolved. She looked like herself. That was the thing that hit him, standing in the kitchen doorway in Portland. She looked entirely, specifically like herself, and it made the 2 weeks feel very long and also very small. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "I know you think that," he said. She set the coffee cup down on the counter. She turned to face him fully. "Nico, let me tell you what happened," he said, "after you left. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm asking you to hear what happened, and then whatever you decide, I'll respect." She looked at him. The measuring look. He held it. "Sit down," she said. He sat at Claire's kitchen table. She stayed standing, leaning against the counter with her arms at her sides. Not crossed, not closed, just still. He told her. He told her about the Friday night at Sal's house and what he'd learned about the letter, about Rosa and the drafts and Diane at the alterations shop, about what the letter had understood about her and how it had used that understanding. He watched her face while he talked. When he told her about the letter, something moved across her expression. Not surprise, because she had not been naive about where it had come from, but something that was the confirmation of a thing she'd guessed at, landing with its full weight now that it had a name and a face. He told her about Soto, about what Enzo had told him in the restaurant, about the 36 hours and Carver and the dinner that had been canceled. He told her about the Ferrara meeting and what had been restructured and what that meant going forward. He told her about Marco's conversation in the office, which he gave her plain, without softening it in Marco's favor or his own. He told her about the conversation with Sal and Rosa in Pelham, what he'd said, what they'd said, what had been left open, and what had been closed. He told her all of it. It took 20 minutes. He didn't ask her for anything while he was talking. He just put it in front of her, the full shape of it, every piece. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. Claire was somewhere else in the house. He'd heard her move away early in the telling, the tact of a young woman who understood when to disappear. Vivian was looking at the window above the sink. The Portland morning, gray and wet, the backyard visible through the glass. A garden, dormant. A fence with something growing along it that wasn't growing yet. "Rosa wrote the letter," she said. "Yes." "I thought so." She was quiet for another moment. "The woman who delivered it said it was from a mutual acquaintance. I knew it wasn't. I didn't know who exactly what, but I knew it was from inside the family." She paused. "I knew it was someone who understood how I thought." "I know." "That's what convinced me," she said. "Not the threats. The threats. I've read enough to know a threat when I see one, and I can sit with the threat. What convinced me was the accuracy. Whoever wrote it knew the exact thing that would make me leave. Not what I feared, what I cared about. She turned from the window and looked at him. That's a very specific kind of knowledge to have about a person. Yes, he said. She loved you, Vivian said. Rosa. That's where that knowledge came from. She paid attention to you for 30 years, and she paid attention to what you cared about, and she used it. She paused. I can't be entirely angry at that. I understand it. Nico looked at her across Claire's kitchen table. You don't have to understand it. I know I don't have to. Something in her voice was very quiet. I'm choosing to. Because it's true, and because being angry at a true thing is... I'm 50 years old. I'm done being angry at true things. He said nothing. She came away from the counter. She pulled out the chair across from him, and she sat down and she put her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she looked at him with the direct look she'd had since the first day, the look that cataloged things without judgment, the look that had undone him in October in a bookstore on West 114th Street. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. The restructuring, the changes you've made, the conversations with your family. She held his eyes. Did you do those things because of me? To get me back? Or did you do them because they needed to be done? He held her gaze. He thought about the 4 days, about the 7 o'clock meeting, and Carver's text, and the Thursday conference room, and the conversations in Pelham, and the Friday evening office. He thought about the 3 in the morning kitchen table, the 30 seconds of feeling he'd allowed himself, the question he'd asked himself about what he wanted the years to contain. Both, he said, they needed to be done. That's true. And they were overdue, and they would have had to happen eventually regardless. But I did them now, in this specific week, in this specific way because of you. He paused. I'm not going to tell you it's clean. It isn't clean. You leaving accelerated a reckoning I'd been managing around. That's the truth. She looked at him. I'm also not going to tell you that everything is fixed, he said. The family is... The relationships are changed, not resolved. There are conversations with Sal still coming. Marco is going to have to prove himself over time, and he may not. The world I operate in is still the world I operate in. None of that disappears. He put his hands on the table, an inch from hers, not touching. What's different is that I've drawn the lines that should have been drawn a long time ago, about what is mine to decide in my own life, about what the people around me have the right to manage. He paused. About you. She looked at their hands on the table, the inch between them. I left, she said, because I thought it was the most honest thing I could do. Her voice had something in it that was neither regret nor apology, but was the sound of someone speaking from the bottom of a decision they made with full knowledge of its cost. I thought if I stayed, I was choosing my own wanting over your safety, over the people around you. I know that. I was not wrong about the structure of the problem, she said. The analysis in that letter was accurate. I was a vulnerability. The family was fractured. Soto was positioned to exploit it. You weren't wrong, he said. But I also... She stopped, breathed once. I made the decision without you. I decided what you needed, and I acted on it, and I didn't let you choose. She looked up at him. I did to you what Rosa did to you. I managed you, out of love, with good intentions, and I still did it. The kitchen was very quiet. Nico looked at the woman across the table from him. The silver in her dark hair, the long hands flat on the wood, the specific quality of her face at this moment. No performance, no management, just the raw, exact truth of what she'd understood about herself in 2 weeks in Portland. Yeah, he said. You did. I'm sorry, she said. Okay, he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's it? Okay. What do you want me to do with it? He said. You understood what you did. You said it plainly. That's more than most people manage. He paused. I'm not going to make you carry it longer than you need to. She looked at him. The look that cataloged things. Her eyes were bright. Not wet exactly, but the brightness that sits just behind wet. the brightness of someone holding something very carefully. "I miss the store," she said. "That's the stupid thing." In the middle of all of it, what I kept thinking about was the map section and whether the water damage in the back had been looked at. "I had someone look at it," he said. She stopped. Tuesday after you left. I didn't go in. I called the landlord, described the problem, arranged for someone to assess it." He paused. "It needed a section of drywall replaced and a sealant on the exterior. It's done." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved. Finally, the thing that had been contained since he'd walked into the kitchen came loose. Not dramatically, just a shift, a small internal door going from less shut to open. "You fixed my wall," she said. "You weren't there to fix it yourself." She put her hand over her mouth briefly, the gesture of someone covering a reaction they weren't planning. Then she lowered it. She looked at the table. She breathed. "I'm not the same person I was when you walked into the store in October," she said. "I know that. I don't have the same life. Whatever I go back to, it's not the same." "I know that too." She looked up at him. "And you're still—" "Yes," he said, before she finished. Because the question had one answer, and it had been the same answer since December outside the door in the sleet, and it was going to keep being the same answer, and there was no version of the conversation where that changed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood. She walked to the window and she looked out at the gray Portland morning and the dormant garden and the fence with the thing not yet growing on it, and she stood there for a while. Then she turned around. "I need a week," she said. "To do this right. To talk to Claire, to close what I opened here, to go back to New York, not like I'm running." She looked at him. "Can you go home and give me a week?" He stood. He looked at her across the kitchen. "Yes," he said. "And when I come back—" She stopped. "When I come back, things are different, not just the people removed or the structure changed. I mean, I'm not a secret. I'm not a liability to manage. I'm a person you're with, and the people in your life know it and accept it, or they deal with you directly about it." "That's already true," he said. "I need to hear it." "It's already true," he said again. "That's what the last week was." She looked at him. A long moment. The Portland morning continued outside, gray and unhurried. "Okay," she said. He held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she walked across the kitchen, and she took it, and he held her hand for a moment. Just that, just her hand in his, the specific warmth of it, the long fingers. And then he let it go. He put his jacket on. He walked back through the hallway with the photographs. He paused at the hook by the door, at the gray cardigan hanging there. He touched the sleeve of it once, briefly, then let it go. He walked out into the Portland rain. What? She came back 8 days later. He was in the store when she arrived. He'd let himself in with the key she'd given him in February, the one he'd never returned, and he turned on the yellow lamp and made tea he didn't drink and sat at the reading table and waited. She came through the door and the bell made its tired sound, and she set her bag down and she looked around the store with the look of someone who has been away from a place and is now checking whether it's still what it was. The maps section, reorganized, the water damage wall, repaired, the front counter, undisturbed, the yellow lamp. She looked at him. "You're in my chair," she said. "Your other chair is right there," he said. She sat in the other chair, across the table from him, under the yellow lamp. The store was quiet around them. The particular after-closing silence she'd once described as different from any other silence. And it was, Nico had decided, different. He'd been in the store twice in the last 8 days, at odd hours, and he'd felt it both times. The specific quality of a room that had been built by one person's sustained attention to what a room should do. She reached out and put her hand flat on the table between them. He put his hand over hers. They sat like that for a while without speaking, in the bookstore on West 114th Street, under the yellow lamp, in the quiet that was specific to that room at that hour. Outside, the city continued. It did not pause or acknowledge or mark the moment. Somewhere uptown, a family was having conversations that were still difficult and would remain difficult for a while. Somewhere in Westchester, a man named Soto was calculating what remained of his operation. Somewhere in a Bensonhurst restaurant, An old man was eating dinner slowly and thinking about things that had ended and things that were beginning, and finding them, on balance, acceptable. In the bookstore, Vivian turned her hand over and held his. The yellow lamp burned the way it always had. The map section was where it should be. The wall was repaired. The silence was the silence of the room, complete, specific, the kind that had been built over years and was not going anywhere. He did not need to say anything. Neither did she. Some things do not require language because they have already been said in full, in the specific grammar of what two people do rather than what they claim. In a fixed wall, in a one-way plane ticket, and a hand turned upward in a lamplit room. And what remains after all the noise and damage and cost is not a resolution, but a choice, made again, in the quiet, by two people who know exactly what it is. That was enough. That was everything.